Picture this. You are walking through the bustling streets of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD. The marble pavements beneath your sandals are warm from the afternoon sun, the air heavy with the scent of incense drifting from temples, and the tang of olives and wine sold in the markets. Around you, the forum hums with life, merchants calling out their wares, senators wrapped in togas debating matters of state, slaves hurrying with amphorae of water balanced on their shoulders. Rome, the beating heart of an empire of more than 60 million souls, feels eternal, unshakable. Yet on this particular day, whispers ripple through the crowd like an unseen current, carrying with them a secret that makes your blood run cold. The emperor himself is here, strolling casually through the forum, surrounded by guards and flatterers. All eyes turn to him, as they always do. Nero, the most powerful man in the world, walks with the arrogance of a man who believes himself half god, half artist. But it is not Nero who draws the collective gasp. It is the figure at his side. Draped in silks of the finest weave, adorned with glittering jewels that catch the Mediterranean light, walks a stunning young woman, her posture graceful, her face delicate, almost ethereal. At first glance, she seems every inch the Empress, and yet everyone knows the truth. For this radiant companion was once a boy. His name was Sporus, and the story of how he came to walk beside Nero, dressed as a bride and paraded as a wife, is one of the most grotesque and haunting tales in all of Roman history. It is not merely a story of cruelty, it is the portrait of how unchecked power can work love into possession, grief into madness, and a human being into nothing more than a living doll sculpted to satisfy the emperor's obsession. Pause for a moment and imagine the weight of that silence, the murmurs slipping between Romans as Nero and his wife passed. In an empire where public spectacle defined truth, no one dared say aloud what everyone could see. Behind polite applause and forced smiles, there was horror. The greatest city in the world was watching a play staged by its emperor, only this was not theater, but life itself, and the cost was a boy's humanity. Before we descend into the labyrinth of this tragedy, consider the fragile line between memory and myth. Rome was a society obsessed with appearances, where masks at the theater blurred reality and performance, and emperors themselves were actors upon the world stage. Nero, more than any ruler, embraced that role, demanding his subjects not only watch, but participate in his theater. And for Sporus, that theater became his prison. His name may not be familiar to most today, but once you hear his story, you will never forget it. To understand how he became trapped in Nero's grotesque fantasy, we must first turn back to the beginning, to Nero himself. Because Sporus's fate was not born in a single act of cruelty. It was forged in the twisted journey of a boy emperor who once held Rome's hopes in his hands and slowly let them rot away. To understand the nightmare that would one day consume Sporus, we must first meet the man at the center of it all, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known simply as Nero. History remembers him as a monster, the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, the tyrant whose name became synonymous with excess and cruelty. Yet the story begins very differently. When Nero ascended the throne in 54 AD, he was just 16 years old, barely more than a boy. And in those first years, he seemed to promise something extraordinary. Many Romans believed they were standing at the dawn of a golden age. The empire, still glowing from the conquests of Augustus and the stability of Claudius, saw in Nero a chance for renewal. His youth suggested energy, his lineage divine legitimacy, and his first acts as emperor brought hope rather than fear. He reduced burdensome taxes that had long weighed down the common people. He poured money into public entertainment, gladiatorial games, chariot races, theatrical productions, delighting a population always hungry for spectacle. He even took the unprecedented step of performing himself on stage, something no emperor had dared before. To many of the ordinary Romans packed into theaters and circuses, Nero was not just their ruler, but their star, dazzling them with poetry, music, and dramatic roles. In a society where emperors were usually remote, untouchable figures, Nero seemed almost approachable. He gave the people what they craved: bread, spectacle, and the illusion that they were part of his vision. Senators and aristocrats, however, looked on with unease. Rome's ruling class had always viewed the stage as disreputable, something for slaves and professionals, never for emperors. To them, Nero's artistic ambitions were humiliating, a disgrace to Rome's dignity. But in those early years, criticism was muted, because for a time Nero truly governed with moderation. Guided by experienced advisors like Seneca, his tutor, and Boris, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, he made decisions that balanced populism with stability. Rome seemed in safe hands. But the throne of the Caesars is never safe for long. Absolute power is intoxicating, it isolates, and it breeds paranoia. Imagine being the single figure at the center of an empire of 60 million people. Every senator, every general, every governor, any one of them could be plotting to replace you. No one can contradict you, no one can challenge you, and those who try often end up dead. The praise becomes suffocating, the applause meaningless, because you know it is compelled by fear. By the mid-60s AD, something in Nero began to fracture. The idealistic young emperor who once seemed to embody Rome's hopes was slipping away. The advisors who had steadied him were dying or losing influence. What replaced them was a darker impulse, an obsession with his own image, his own pleasures, his own desires, no matter the cost. The seeds of that downfall were not only political, but deeply personal, and they were about to bloom in the form of a woman who would define the course of his reign, Poppaea Sabina. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and to Nero she was everything. To Rome she was both fascination and scandal. Poppaea was no ordinary woman of the court. She possessed a beauty that ancient writers described as luminous, almost otherworldly. Her skin pale as marble, her hair golden and gleaming in the sun. But beauty alone does not secure a place in the perilous world of imperial politics. What set Poppaea apart was her mind. She was ambitious, calculating, and shrewd. She understood how to navigate the currents of power in a city where a whisper in the wrong ear could end a dynasty. When Nero first laid eyes on her, he was already married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor, Claudius. Octavia was dutiful, modest, and reserved, the perfect political bride, but not a woman who could stir Nero's restless spirit. To him, she was the gray silence of duty. Poppaea, on contrast, was a blaze of color. Where Octavia avoided attention, Poppaea thrived in it. She commanded every room she entered. She did not simply accept the role of consort, she demanded to be noticed, to be admired, to be adored. Their affair began like many in Rome, an open secret in a society where marital fidelity was rare among the powerful. But what started as indulgence quickly escalated into obsession. Nero was not simply infatuated, he was consumed. Ancient historians tell us he would watch Poppaea with a fervor that bordered on worship, his mood swinging wildly if he thought another man admired her too more. He began surrounding her with guards, ostensibly for her safety, but in truth to monitor her every interaction. The gifts followed, treasures from the farthest edges of the empire, jewels from India that glittered with impossible colors, silks from the east that clung like water to her skin, perfumes from Arabia so rare they were worth more than a senator's estate. These were not offerings of love, but trophies, each one a symbol of possession. Rome itself was being emptied to feed his hunger for her, and still.
This was not love as the world understands it. This was theater. And Poppaea, whether willingly or not, became the leading actress in Nero's grand delusion. He was not simply her husband. He was her audience, her director, her master. Yet Poppaea was no fool. She recognized the perilous game she was forced to play. Her beauty gave her power, but power in Rome was always precarious. She wielded it with precision, using Nero's obsession to secure influence for her family, whispering advice that shaped imperial policy, ensuring her position was not only ornamental, but political. She understood that to resist was death, but to bend too easily was also dangerous. The key was balance, to feed Nero's hunger for control while keeping enough independence to survive. But balance, with a man like Nero, was impossible. His obsession was a flame that devoured everything around it. What had begun as desire now consumed him, and soon the woman he adored would discover the true cost of being loved by an emperor who could not distinguish between devotion and domination. Poppaea Sabina was not merely beautiful, she was ambitious. And in the treacherous world of Rome's imperial court, ambition was both weapon and curse. She had ascended higher than nearly any woman in the empire, not only as empress, but as the axis of Nero's obsession. Yet Poppaea knew that her position was never secure. An emperor's love could turn as quickly as the tide of the Tiber, and the palace was filled with rivals eager to see her fall. So she wielded her influence with calculation. Through Nero, she advanced the fortunes of her family, placing allies in positions of authority. She whispered in his ear about which senators should be trusted, which generals rewarded, which enemies punished. Some sources suggest it was Poppaea who encouraged Nero to take harsher measures against the old aristocratic families who resented his reign, cutting away potential threats while strengthening her own circle. In a city where every alliance was fragile and every friendship provisional, Poppaea was building a web of protection. But there was a fatal flaw in her strategy. Unlike Octavia, who had endured Nero's neglect in silence, Poppaea was not afraid to speak her mind. She challenged him in ways no one else dared. She questioned his decisions, criticized his indulgence in the theater, even mocked his performances when she thought them lacking. For an emperor who demanded worship from the world, such defiance was intolerable. And yet, he could not bring himself to silence her. His love for her was too consuming, too bound to the image of her perfection. He tolerated her defiance, until the day he could not. Ancient writers describe Nero's moods during this time as unpredictable, swinging from indulgent affection to volcanic rage. Courtiers lived in fear of the moments when the emperor and his empress quarreled, for their words could shake the entire palace. Poppaea, clever and sharp, was willing to risk his temper. Perhaps she believed her influence protected her. Perhaps she trusted in his obsession, knowing he could not live without her. But obsession is a dangerous shield. For while it may hold off enemies, it cannot guard against the madness of the one who wields it. Poppaea was playing a game no one could win, standing her ground against a man who believed himself both artist and god, a man whose love was indistinguishable from possession. The stage was set for tragedy. All it required was a spark, a single quarrel too sharp, a single challenge too bold to bring the storm crashing down. The breaking point came in 65 AD. The details differ depending on which ancient historian you believe, but all accounts agree on the same devastating outcome. Poppaea Sabina, pregnant with what would have been Nero's second child, lost her life at the hands of the man who claimed to love her beyond reason. Some sources say it began with a quarrel over Nero's late return from the chariot races, where he spent more time with horses and performers than with his Empress. Others suggest the argument was about his endless obsession with the theater, his hunger to be admired as a singer and actor rather than as a ruler. But one version, preserved by Tacitus, cuts deepest. Poppaea accused Nero of caring more for his reputation than for his duties as husband and father. Imagine the scene: an empress, heavily pregnant, her voice sharp with frustration, her words striking at the one wound Nero could not bear: his insecurity, his desperate need to be adored. In that moment, the emperor lost control. Whether it was a single kick to her abdomen, as Suetonius claims, or a series of savage blows, as others suggest, the result was the same. Poppaea collapsed, bleeding on the marble floor of the palace, her cries echoing through the gilded halls. The life inside her, Nero's unborn heir, was extinguished before it could draw breath. The wedding had already shocked Rome, but Nero was not finished. Marriage did not satisfy his need to own her completely. Slowly, he began isolating her from everyone who might remind her that she was more than his possession. Friends vanished from her circle. Family visits grew infrequent. Those who remained were carefully chosen, men and women who owed their position entirely to Nero's favor and would never contradict him. Even Poppaea's daily routines became performances for his eyes alone. Ancient writers tell us that Nero could sit for hours, watching her move about the palace as though she were a living statue, admired not for who she was, but for how perfectly she filled the role he demanded.
Then came the silence. Picture the emperor standing over the woman he had once worshipped as divine, realizing the enormity of what he had done. Nero, master of 30 legions, worshipped as a god in the eastern provinces, a man whose word could decide the fate of millions, reduced in an instant to a murderer of the one he cherished most. Ancient writers describe what followed as one of the most pitiful spectacles in Roman history. Nero fell to his knees beside Poppaea's body, weeping, begging her to live, as if his imperial command could defy death itself. He called for the best physicians in Rome, offering riches beyond measure for her survival, threatening torture if they failed. But all the power of the empire could not undo the violence of his own hands. Within hours, Poppaea was dead. And with her death, something inside Nero shattered. Grief consumed him, but this was no ordinary mourning. It was madness. He refused to cremate her according to Roman custom, instead having her body embalmed and entombed in splendor greater than that of past emperors. He declared her a goddess, ordering temples and rituals in her honor. The court was forced to participate in his delusion, speaking of Poppaea as if she still lived, leaving her seat empty at banquets, pretending she lingered among them. For Nero, reality itself was bending. He could not accept the truth that he had destroyed the woman he loved. And in this desperate attempt to rewrite reality, he would soon look for a replacement, not a woman, not even a willing partner, but a mirror image of Poppaea herself. And in that search, fate would deliver him to the young boy who would become the most tragic figure of his reign, Sporus. After Poppaea's death, Nero was no longer the same man.
The empire still bowed before him, still hailed him as Caesar, but within the palace walls he became a hollow shell, tormented, erratic, and consumed by grief. But grief alone was not what poisoned him. It was denial. Nero could not bear the truth that he, in a fit of rage, had destroyed the woman he adored most. So he reshaped reality itself. Poppaea was not dead. She was divine. He commanded that she be worshipped as a goddess, her statues garlanded with flowers, her name invoked in prayers. At banquets, her place remained set, as though she might return at any moment. Courtiers were forced to speak of Poppaea as though she lingered still, a ghostly presence hovering over Rome's glittering halls. Yet even this charade was not enough. Nero longed not only for her memory, but for her physical presence, her face, her voice, her touch. And so his grief began to warp into obsession, a hunger that sought to recreate what death had taken away. He surrounded himself with women who resembled Poppaea, dressing them in her garments, adorning them with her jewels. But none could satisfy him, because none were truly her. And then, into this madness, fate delivered a boy. His name was Sporus, a young slave of extraordinary beauty, delicate features, and, according to ancient writers, an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea herself. When Nero's eyes fell on him, it was as if destiny had offered him a way to undo the past. Sporus was not merely another court favorite. He was, in Nero's mind, the chance to bring Poppaea back. What followed would be one of the most infamous acts in imperial history, the Emperor of Rome deciding that a boy could be transformed into his dead wife, that Sporus could be remade, not as himself, but as Poppaea reborn. To achieve this, Nero would cross every boundary of Roman tradition, morality, and human dignity. What began as grief had now become delusion, and soon it would become cruelty. For most Romans, Sporus was a boy of little consequence, a beautiful youth, enslaved in the shadows of the palace. But for Nero, he was something far greater, the vessel through which his beloved Poppaea would live again. Ancient writers describe the emperor's obsession in chilling detail. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated, robbing him of his manhood, halting the passage of time so that he would remain smooth-faced, delicate, forever frozen in the likeness of a woman. This was not merely cruelty, it was transformation. In Nero's mind, Sporus was no longer himself. He was to be Poppaea reborn. The boy was dressed in the Empress's gowns, draped in silks once worn by the dead queen. He was adorned with her jewels, the same treasures Nero had once lavished upon her in life. He was taught to walk, to speak, even to carry himself as Poppaea had done. Step by step, the emperor erased Sporus's identity and replaced it with hers. And then, in one of the most scandalous spectacles Rome had ever witnessed, the Emperor of Rome took Sporus as his bride. The ceremony was conducted with all the rites of a traditional Roman wedding. Sporus, veiled and robed, was led through the rituals as though he were a woman. The imperial court, bound by fear and obedience, stood by and watched as the most powerful man in the world married a boy he had remade in the image of his dead wife.
For the people of Rome, it was madness. For Nero, it was devotion. In Sporus, he did not see a broken child forced into a role against his will. He saw Poppaea, alive once more, a living echo of the woman he could not release. But beneath the spectacle, tragedy lingered, for Sporus was not Poppaea. He was a boy stripped of his future, condemned to live not as himself, but as a shadow, a reflection, a ghost of a woman he had never been. His life was no longer his own. It was Nero's delusion made flesh. This was love twisted beyond recognition, obsession turned into tyranny. And as Rome watched in horrified fascination, the line between devotion and destruction blurred completely. No longer even a person, he was Poppaea reborn, a fragile illusion the emperor clung to with desperate obsession. Everywhere Nero went, Sporus followed, dressed in the silks of an empress, veiled in purple and gold, jewels glittering on a body that had never chosen this fate. He sat beside Nero in the imperial box at the games, carried in litters through the streets of Rome, displayed to the people as though he truly were the empress returned from death. The crowd murmured in shock, but none dared laugh too loudly or speak too freely, for mockery of Nero's delusion could be fatal. Behind palace doors, Sporus's life was little better. He lived under constant surveillance, his body and actions controlled by the emperor's will. He was expected to move, to speak, even to smile as Poppaea once had. Each day was a performance on a stage from which he could never escape. For a boy of such youth, torn from his own identity, the weight of this role must have been unbearable. And yet, survival required submission. Sporus learned quickly that resistance brought punishment, and so he endured. He endured the stares of senators forced to bow before him, the whispers of slaves who pitied him, the suffocating devotion of a man who believed himself in love. To Nero, he was not a victim, but a gift of the gods, a miracle that had granted him back his beloved Poppaea. To Sporus, he was a prisoner in silks. Still, the strange union of emperor and boy was not without consequence. By binding Sporus to himself so openly, Nero inflamed Rome's hatred. The aristocracy mocked him in whispers. Foreign rulers laughed at his weakness, and even among the common people, murmurs grew louder. Their emperor had lost all sense of dignity, all grip on reality. Nero could not see it, or would not. He paraded Sporus as though the world adored them both, but with each procession, each spectacle, he only fueled the fire of discontent that one day would consume him. And when that fire finally rose, when Rome and its legions turned against the mad emperor, Sporus too would be dragged into the storm.